All right, so what is the Damascus Document? What is the Damascus Document? I told you already once a little bit, but say it again. The Damascus Document, called the Damascus Document because it refers to Damascus at some point. Literally, the new covenant in the land of Damascus. That's what I wrote this book about, basically. The reason I call it the New Testament Code, this book, is because New Testament really means New Covenant. And I subtitled it, The Cup of the Lord, the Damascus Covenant, and the Blood of Christ, because you have in the Damascus Document a covenant, a new covenant in the land of Damascus. That's why it's called that. And you know that in the New Testament, Damascus is a big deal, particularly in the book of Acts and to a lesser extent in Paul's letters. But Paul supposedly has a vision on the road to Damascus. The Damascus Document speaks about the star, or the interpreter of the law, interpreting the star prophecy, who came to Damascus. That doesn't mean it's the same. I'm just saying they're in the same framework of reference. 2 Corinthians talks about Paul's escape down the walls of Damascus in a basket. Book of Acts says Paul escaped down the walls of Damascus in a basket because he had thrown the Jewish synagogues there into confusion and to escape the Jews who wanted to kill him. Sounds a bit like my toast in the all-white garden, I think. Person's been reading the same literature, obviously. The Waldheim literature. I don't want to, but if you look at Paul's letter to the Corinthians, I think it's chapter 11, second letter to the Corinthians, he says he escaped down the walls of Damascus in a basket to escape the Arab king Aretas' representatives who wanted to arrest him. That's a bit of a shift. Oh, what's the answer? The official answer. Oh, Paul escaped down the walls of Damascus twice. Once from the Jews who wanted to kill him, ergo Acts, and once from the representatives of Aretas who wanted to arrest him. Oh, come on. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't think he went down the walls of Damascus twice. Shall we try for 3? No, I don't think so. In New Testament studies, primary documents always take precedence over secondary documents. I've said that to you before, but I'll say it to you again. Paul's letters, insofar as they're authentic, are primary documents. They take precedence over things like Acts or the Gospels, which are secondary documents. What do I mean? They're documents based on what someone thinks someone else said or did, what third parties present someone else as saying or doing. I know that in religious environments, those are considered the Word of God. Well, so be it. For religious environments, some religious environments, bin Laden is the Word of God, and others are expecting the Mahdi to return pretty soon, and so on and so forth. We've had some religious individuals sitting here who probably have some very strange views of what would be entertained as historical truth. Antichrists and angels and different things like that. I once asked some of my students, have you ever seen an angel? And some have, some haven't. But I know that, I gave that example, but I know the angel dictated the Quran to Muhammad and so on. Gabriel, of course, who isn't the dictating angel as we saw. But, as I think I once implied here, if I were down in the student union and I were talking to someone, hey, I was on the way up in the freeway in my car this morning and an angel suddenly appeared to me, people sitting around me in the student union would pull away and try to move their tables away. Because you see, what in the past we accept as fact, in the present we would put someone in an institution for. I know that's harsh, but think about it and you'll see it as true. claims that are in the past we accept. But if someone's made the same claim in the present, we would think they were ready for institutionalization or something else. And that's just the way people's minds work. They credit things in the past that they would not credit in the present. So secondary documents, secondary documents that have more literary materials in them. So what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, trying to escape the representatives of Aretas, trumps trying to escape the Jews who wanted to kill him. It may have been both, but the point is that one is different than the other. And it's been consciously shifted by somebody. It's been conscious of someone who wanted to make it more unpleasant, put it that way. But there were Jews who wanted to kill Paul. That comes out later in Acts because of some of the things he was preaching, and but I don't think this was going on in Damascus. So in any event, for instance, the vision on the road to Damascus is not mentioned in Galatians. It's only Acts, recreation of something. Paul says in Galatians 1, if you haven't read it, you should read it. I was, I think, something about meeting Peter. In any case, I went to Damascus, and then I went away to Arabia, and I didn't come back to Damascus for 3 years. But it doesn't say anything about a vision on the road to Damascus. That's literary elaboration. True or false is up to you to decide. So, Galatians trumps Acts. 2 Corinthians trumps Acts. Acts may be true, but those things are what we call first-person testimony. So Damascus is very important. I think you'll find if you read some of my books, James or this other book, that Arabia extended, and I have a map in here of Arabia, where the Romans thought all this area were Arabs and Arabia. And I have a map here that shows here that Arabia extends all the way up, just like we are today here in Mesopotamia, this whole area here, and even into northern Syria. I think Paul went away to northern Syria, to what we today might refer to as Antioch. But there were 4 Antiochs at that time in the Seleucid Empire. I told you that. One by the Mediterranean, one in what we call Turkey, Antioch Pisidia, as Acts calls it. One down by the Gulf of Persian Gulf, which is today called Basra. It had, I forget what, I have it on the map in there, it's Antioch something else. And one in northern Syria that we ended up calling Edessa, which is, by the way, where the Holy Shroud came from, which is really interesting. Of course, there were important conversions taking place in northern Syria at this time. By the way, that's my theory about MMT, that it was a letter, because there's a king mentioned in there. And it's obviously not a Jewish king, because it's a king who needs tuition about the law. And it seems to be addressed to a king who's clearly a convert king. And I think it's a letter to this king in northern Syria, where Paul was operating, by the way. Josephus talks about a Queen Helen of Adiabene and her conversion to Judaism. Adiabene is northern Syria, northern Iraq, today what we call Kurdistan. I don't know if they were actual Kurds there at this time. We've all heard of Kurds now. And she'd be a Kurdish queen, although I don't know if they were called Kurds then and what the population consistency exactly was. But she was also, I think, the Syriac texts tell us she was married to the king in the Edessenes. And Eusebius talks about that. He says he found a document in the chancellery offices of Edessa, which is Antioch Orho, the Syrian Antioch, or Antioch by Calirho, Antioch on the river Calirho, not Antioch on the Orontes, which is the city in present-day northern Lebanon, Syrian Mediterranean coastline, which is what Christianity thinks Antioch was. No, I think when the book of Acts says Christians were first called Christians in Antioch, they mean northern Syria. They don't mean, I don't think anything was happening on the coast of the Mediterranean Antioch. Nothing whatsoever at this time. It's really all going on there in northern Syria. So when Paul says he went away to Arabia, and then he came back after 3 years, I think he's talking about going up to Edessa, northern Syria. And Josephus says that this woman, Queen Helen, had 2 sons. And this merchant, Ananias, got into her home environment. And he had another unnamed companion that he doesn't mention. Don't forget, Ananias is the person Acts says Paul met in Damascus when he was supposedly blinded. To me, that's all the fictionalized Paul. In any case, Helen's sons were reading the Bible, the Torah, Genesis, about Abraham's conversion, about Abraham's circumcision. You know, Paul's very anti-circumcision in Galatians and other letters that I've shown. And James is called the leader of the party of the circumcision. James is representative of, I'm not caring, as I told you before, for or against circumcision. That's not my thing that I'm trying to emphasize. I'm just trying to say that's what distinguishes the two. And as we said before, circumcision is the sign of the covenant. So the James party was obviously saying, before you're heir to the promises of the covenant, you must come in under the covenant, which is a reasonable position to some extent to take. You want to be heirs to the covenant. You have to first come into the covenant. Which is why the Sicarii, in that other version of Josephus I mentioned, were threatening to kill anyone who was discussing the law who was not circumcised. Because you couldn't discuss the law according to Hippolytus, as I told you, the end of last time version of the Sicarii Essenes, unless you first come into the law. Which is why I think the people in Acts who took an oath on themselves, with an oath we have cursed ourselves, not to eat or drink, like James doesn't eat or drink wine, doesn't eat meat or drink wine, not to eat or drink till we have killed Paul. I think that's authentic episode. It's in the We document material. The We document in Acts begins, I've told you, after chapter 16. And that's very different from anything before that in Acts. The Damascus Road material is around chapter 8 or 9 or 10. That's different kind of material. The We document material is obviously based on a travel diary of somebody, and I would assume it's Lucius of Cyrene, or whatever he's called in other environments. Lucius and Lucas are, one's Greek and the other's Latin. But in any case, Josephus has this whole thing in the Antiquities, not in your war. Chapter 20 of the Antiquities begins with Queen Helen's conversion. It's a very big deal for Josephus. And also in rabbinic literature, Queen Helen's conversion is a very big thing. The rabbis, rabbinic literature, thinks she converts to rabbinic Judaism. But in Josephus doesn't tell what form. He just says that Ananias and another unnamed companion got in among Helen's people and said that you didn't have to be circumcised. Because Helen supposedly had a horror of circumcision, thought her subjects would hold her in a negative view. Well, what happens is her 2 sons, which is why I kind of dedicate my James book to her 2 sons, or at least the offspring of her. I mentioned Lord Wingate was one of the persons I dedicated the James book to, and the other one was, I guess it was the 2 sons of the Ethiopian queen, I called them, in my consensus review in the New York Times, who've been put up to do a hatchet job with the James book. I said, oh, Eisenman doesn't even know that these 2 people are not even the sons of the Ethiopian queen. Yeah, because he didn't get up to chapter 22 of that book where I talk about who the Ethiopian queen is. And that it's really this Queen Helen of Adiabene is a parody of her. And these two sons that fought in the first engagement of the war in Josephus, what were their names? Kennedeus and what was the other one's name? Anyway, Helen's two descendants, perhaps, maybe not her sons, died in the first engagements of the war against Rome. So I think Queen Helen was involved in financing the war against Rome. Her descendants were involved in that situation. In any case, Josephus spends a lot of time on this conversion. He says that her two sons, Monobasus and Isat. Isat is the oldest one. He's her favorite. We're reading how, I think it's chapter 17 of Genesis says, and the angel appeared to Abraham and he circumcised everybody, and then he circumcised all the people that were traveling with him. And then this other teacher comes, Eliezer from Galilee, and says to the two boys, or the two young men, do you understand the meaning of what you are reading? And they immediately went out and circumcised, had themselves circumcised. And in book of Acts, you'll remember Philip, who was supposed to be the treasurer of the Ethiopian queen, who comes to Jerusalem to pay homage to Jesus, supposedly. And there was no Ethiopian queen at this time, any place, anywhere, anyway. It's the sort of climax of my James book. He jumps up on the chariot of the eunuch of the Ethiopian queen, who's bearing her, who's her treasury agent. And he's reading the Bible, and Philip says to him, do you understand the meaning of what you are reading? And he's reading Isaiah 53:11, the key scriptural basis of the Christian understanding of Jesus' death. And I forget, he took our sins upon himself, he was wounded for us, and so on and so forth. I think you've all heard of parts of Isaiah 53:11. And then the eunuch immediately got down from the chariot and was baptized. And then Philip evaporated. To me, that's a parody of the Queen Helen's son story, reversed. That's how important Damascus really is in all this. And the land of Damascus is the whole area, or Arabia. And the eunuch is a parody of circumcision, because the Romans saw circumcision as bodily mutilation, as a eunuch would do. That's how subtle these things are, in my mind, and how complex they are, and how you can open them with the key of the scrolls in the early history of the church. But you have to know these things. You have to know the early history of the church. You see, if you think Kurt Waldheim is the greatest living man of the 20th century, I really couldn't trust your view of the first century. I wouldn't think your historical view was going to be very substantiatable. That's the problem with philologists, people who only work on manuscripts, people who do philology, language. They may not be very good historians or literary critics. That's our big problem, Dead Sea Scroll study. That's why we can do something at Cal State Long Beach, with all of its lack of so-called prestige, that is equal to or superior to what can be done at Harvard and Oxford or Notre Dame. Because those people may not be very good historians. They may be very good text people. They may be able to separate piles of paleographic materials into different manuscripts, etc. Or they may be able to reconstruct a manuscript. Maybe you should read that chap's history. When he finally did reconstruct MFD, you should read what he makes of it in the Oxford publication series. I don't want to say what he made of it, but I say I made of it as a letter of James to a Jamesian letter to the great king of the peoples beyond the Euphrates. Now you've got to even know that there was a great king of the peoples beyond the Euphrates before you can even know that. And It's Eusebius who tells us about, through the chancellery offices, about the conversion of the great king of the peoples beyond the Euphrates, also at the hands of one Ananias. They're all very complicated, but I think Izates and the great king of the peoples beyond the Euphrates are one and the same person, just from different perspectives. It's very complicated. It's all in my James book. It's why it's 1,000 pages and I can't, do it on one foot now. But that's won't tell you how important the Damascus document is. So we just want to see the parallels. And what happened was the Cairo Geniza is a place, Geniza in Hebrew means where you deposit or secret away either dead or used documents. In Jewish law, you don't secret away things that have the name of God on them. So someone said that you wanted me to pass around a roll sheet, so I got to find one here. So fouled up here. Here's one. Okay. You want to put a date on that and pass it around? So in Hebrew manuscripts, if they have the name of God on something, you can't destroy it. You can only bury it like a human or secret away. That's what Geniza was. This is an old synagogue in Cairo, where some Qumran documents were found in the late 1800s, 1896 to be exact. In this Geniza, there were materials from the whole Mediterranean world. Jewish trading documents, marriage contracts, correspondence, prayer books. It was in a sealed synagogue in Cairo that the British came upon when they took over the administration of Cairo. And a Jewish scholar from Cambridge, a fellow called Solomon Schechter, went out and edited this material, took it all back to Cambridge. And he is really the founder of conservative Judaism in America, because after he made a name for himself in these ways, he came to America. Well, in the process, some scroll materials were found. One thing, the Hebrew copy of Ecclesiasticus was found. That had never been seen before, only Greek, Ethiopic, other versions of the Ecclesiasticus. Later, a similar document was found on Masada, where the Sicaris committed suicide. Also, this Damascus fragment. Two different manuscripts. We call it Manuscript A and Manuscript B. In my translation, Dead Sea Scrolls from the First Christians, I have that document in both the versions. Manuscript B doesn't have all the columns, it just has 2 columns. But it differs from Manuscript A. It overlaps and it differs, which shows that the document was still developing when the versions that finally arrived in the Cairo Geniza were done. That's why we wanted to see the parallels. You can see how important that would be to see what was parallel at Qumran. I think both versions were parallel. I have to check that, but I think they were. Finally, when they were finally published them. Now, it's so funny, I don't want to be over, bearing about this or egocentric or whatever. But I think I'll take credit for calling it the Damascus document. Because if you look in all the old books, this document is called the Zadokite document, or the Zadokite fragments, or then people like Vermes, in their original version of their work, are calling it the Damascus Rule. I think I have it here. No, I don't think not that one. They're calling it the Damascus Rule. Here, I have it here. Because they were calling everything rule. They had, this is one of his early words, they had the war rule, the Messianic rule, the community rule, and the Damascus rule. Well, I never thought it was a Damascus rule or anything like that. And you look at my Maccabees Zadokites, I started calling it, combining the two, the Damascus document. Now, if you pick up Vermes's book now, even though he criticizes me in that weird way that he does, which is totally unwarranted, he says that I say Paul is the wicked priest, which shows he's never read any of my work. He said it in his original work. He says it in that book too, in a footnote. And so, of course, if you have someone saying something ridiculous, you can make them look like a fool. But the point is, it shows that he's never read any of my work, because as I told you previously, I specifically distinguish between the wicked priest and the righteous teacher. I think I was the first to do that. That is, that there are two enemies at Qumran. One is responsible for the destruction of the righteous teacher, who is the official high priest of the time, and the other is someone within the community, an opponent within the community called the liar. Now, that's what I think of the literary critical talents. Official Qumran theory up to that point had just assumed that the liar and the wicked priest were the same person. And I, in my work, identified that they were two different people. One was an ideological adversary within the movement. He was at the scriptural exegesis sessions of the righteous teacher, according to the Habakkuk commentary. He was within the movement. The other was an external adversary. So Mr. Vermes, having accepted the official theory, thinks that I'm saying that the liar and the wicked priest are the same person. So therefore he can laugh and say, Eisenman says Paul is the wicked priest. When I'm only saying Paul is like an internal adversary, such as you would find in the Paul-James issue in the early Christian community. So that's what people can do to you. And his work will be read over and over and over again. People said, oh, why don't I sue you? Well, you just heard the reason why I don't sue anybody. I'm not interested in getting the legal entanglements. Oh, you should have made it, take it back. No, I'm not interested. You know, if people want to think that, if that's what they want to think, fine. I criticized him in my New Testament code on that particular issue and tried to make it clear that wasn't the case. So in any case, you'll see that in the new book, isn't right? He calls it the Damascus Document, doesn't he? Yeah, well, he didn't give me a footnote on that, but I think you'll look in the works. I don't know, maybe you'll Google someone up and you'll find it somewhere else. But don't come back and tell me. I really don't want to know. It would pain me to find that I wasn't. So please don't tell me. I like to think, I like to dream, okay? I don't want to be woken up. So in any case, I never saw it anywhere else. So I think that now everyone calls it the Damascus Document, which is good. That's what it is. I mean, that's the best name for it. That's the easiest way to refer to it. What happened was two versions got in this Geza, and everyone realized that it was a very important document, but no one knew what it was. Lo and behold, when the scrolls were discovered, some 10 or 11 different copies of it were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the reason they like to date it early is from their paleographic theories, because there's some early-looking handwriting on some of the documents. They then try to put it back into the 1st or 2nd century BC. But I don't think that that necessarily can stand up against internal evidence that counterindicates that. And the New Covenant is a new idea. But the New Covenant in the land of Damascus is the very opposite of the New Covenant in the blood of Christ. Unless there's an esoteric understanding of the New Covenant in the land of Damascus that I talk about in the last chapters of my New Testament code book. But we'll get to that another time. How did these documents get into the Cairo Geza? Well, we don't know that, and we don't realize that. Most people are not aware of that. But there were documents that came to light around the 800s in Jerusalem. We have testimony of, I think, some metropolitan or Syriac priest or something like that left a record of strange Hebrew documents that suddenly appeared on the market in Jerusalem in the late 700s, early 800s. Now, for those who are interested in the development of Judaism, we know a movement in Judaism called Karaism. The Karaites suddenly began returning to Jerusalem after this time. Now, the Karaites were a movement within Judaism that were against rabbinic Judaism. This is for my friend who's going to go to the HUC. We hope we could wake her up for that one, okay? So the Karaites were against rabbinic Judaism movement, and they're supposedly called Karaites because Kara means to read, that they were for the written text. It may be that. Also in Islam it means to be a propagandist, to call the people to revolution or to Islam or to the early propagandists in Iraq, the Muslim Shiite religious developments were called, you know, similar things in Arabic. I'm not sure whether it was for one reason or another, but a fellow called Anon ben David has founded the Karaites in around the 800s period. In any case, it's clear that the Karaites incorporated Dead Sea Scroll documents in their ideology. Now, I don't know if it. I think this was a Karaite synagogue in Old Cairo originally, but I'm not completely sure of that. But in any case, it probably got to either it was direct transmission over time, that was documents all didn't disappear in the caves, or it was these documents discovered in the 800s that made their way ultimately into the Cairo Geza. That's what I think. That the documents that appeared on the scene in the 800s, ultimately some of them went into the Cairo Geza at some point, copies of them, not necessarily the original one, certainly. One looks a little bit original to me, but I'm not sure about that. But the script, the other, is the longer one, is very medieval. In any event, I think that's how the evening press got. So all that goes back to CD. All that goes back, all that toasts, everything else, Damascus, goes back to what I was telling you about CD. So let's go to the cave thing and finish this up, if we possibly can. So what happened was, 1947-48, in the middle of all this trouble, a Bedouin, you see, that's my preface to it, seems to have thrown a rock into a cave and heard some broken pots. He took these things up to Antiquities dealer in Bethlehem called Kanda. It's in all the... Kanda was a Syriac Christian of some kind. And he ultimately took the materials to the Syriac metropolitan in Jerusalem. I think his name was Mar Athanasius. Mar Athanasius, I think so. Anyway, I don't know. Anyway, he was very impressed. And he says that he's written a book about what happened to him, and he says that he was of those, I think, among the Armenian refugees that had come down the dislocations in eastern Turkey that are now being talked about as a form of genocide, and all the controversy concerning whether you should call it genocide or not. In any case, he had been, I think, a little boy in that situation, and he claims he had visions which saved him, that he would one day see secret manuscripts of some kind, whether I have it exactly right, it's in his work. So he claims he immediately saw the reports of these manuscripts, and he could even read them because he knew Syriac. And he told the dealer to come back next week with some more. I don't know if I believe this story, but it's the official story you'll find everywhere. And when he came back the next week, the gatekeeper at the church enclave in this quarter of Jerusalem shooed him away because he didn't know who he was or something like that. I can't imagine that could have possibly happened, but never mind. Anyway, this guy then went around hawking the materials that day in Jerusalem in the middle of all the tension and dislocation that was going on. He ended up somehow at the Hebrew University campus, and the Israeli scholar, whose name was Sukenik. Now, as it turned out, this man Sukenik was the father of another Israeli scholar who became famous as an Israeli general and chief of staff. When you became an official Israeli person, you had to change your name to Hebrewize it, and he became Yigal Yadin. His father was a professor at the Hebrew University. So you take a Hebrew name after you've occupied an official position in Israel. You probably took it before that. But in any case, he rose to be, in the war period, chief of staff at some point. When the Six-Day War occurred in 1967, he wasn't really chief of staff at that time, but he had an influence. He rushed with a jeep to this Kando's property in Bethlehem, because he knew that Kando had other manuscript, because it had been shown him, pieces of it, that he was trying to sell that he had hidden. And he dug up this guy's whole garden or whatever, and they finally found it stuffed up a chimney in a cigar box. And that's what's called the Temple Scroll. It's supposed to be 11QG, 11Q Temple. It's supposed to come from Cave 11. That's why I say not sure that it came from there, but that's where. And it's the longest Qumran manuscript. It's about 61 or so columns. And it has a lot about temple worship, and it's considered a sixth law book. That is, it's in the first person. God speaking in the first person to the Jews like he might do in Deuteronomy or Leviticus. And it does have a lot about the temple. That's not all it has. It has other things that are very important. Now, the whole bottom of it is rotted away because it was up the chimney and it got all wet, that part of it. But the top of it is in good shape. And as it gets further in, it gets better. It gets better because the inner columns are better preserved than the outer columns. So when you get to the 40s, 50s, and 60s columns, they're much better than the 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 10s. In any case, this has an attack on niece marriage in it, as the Damascus Document does. It also has the king law. The king shall marry one wife and only one wife during his lifetime, and she should be a Jewish wife, and he should not divorce during the lifetime of that wife. Now, we've already seen that Herod had 10 wives, and the Herodians divorced at will, and they married their nieces as a family policy. Now, I take that as internal evidence, showing that the people being attacked at Qumran are the Herodians. Now, I may be a fool, but I read the documents. I don't listen to what my professors say, since I didn't have any professors who taught me this subject.
So the people being attacked were Herodians?
By the documents at Qumran are the Herodians and their hangers-on.
Oh.
I'll get into that another time. But the point being that it's not just, it's in the Damascus Document too. But the very attack on polygamy and everything, that has to be anti-Herod. There's no indication the Maccabees were doing much of this, if any. That's why we read all that material. That's why I have you read all of it. So that you can make determinations of this kind. You just don't read books that you don't understand. But you have the evidence at your fingertips to make the determinations that need to be made. You understand? That's the whole point of why I bored you to death for, 7 periods. Because anyone can read the materials. Like you can read the materials in one day. It doesn't mean anything. You're not going to learn anything. If you don't have the data which to evaluate it or weigh it or plug it into. You understand? I didn't finish this, even I'm going to with you as we go along. I want to do this. Well, to go back to Cave 1. So the Hebrew University professor was so excited he bought some of the manuscripts from this person. And that's what ended up in what the Israelis call the Shrine of the Book. I don't know if you've ever seen the Shrine of the Book or pictures of it, but it's got a big black slab next to an acorn-looking building, which has a white kind of roof. I always thought that was kind of an inverted acorn. It looked like this. And then it had a big black slab next to it. I only realized later that black slab was supposed to be the Bible, architectural representation of the Bible. And this was supposed to be the lid of a scroll jar. That's where they put their materials from Cave 1, which included Isaiah, the oldest Isaiah document, the community rule, other things of that kind, Habakkuk Pesher. They're in a very good state of preservation because though they weren't in jars any longer, they'd been in jars. And it was clear that Cave 1 had been entered previously because there were broken jars or material over the floor. So I think it would have been entered certainly back in 800, if not some other time. That's why we went into all the caves from Cal State Long Beach when we could, because we didn't feel anyone had done a proper walking survey. We went all the way down the coast down to what's called En-Gedi. You look on the map, that's about, I would say, maybe 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers down the coast, 25 miles or so. And our people went into every cave, any cave they could get to. And we went into some 400 or 500 caves or indentations. And you could see every place we went, the Bedouin had been every place. We didn't go to places where you needed fancy ropes and things to get into, because they wouldn't have been in there either to some extent, the people that were involved in this process. Well, we didn't have permission to do that anyway, but it was sufficient to go into what we could get into. And we mapped that whole area. That's what we were doing when they served us with that lawsuit, and I had to leave for a while. The Cave 1 materials that Marthanasius also then bought. After the war was over in 48-49, he went to Hoboken, New Jersey, where there was a Syriac church of some kind, to become the minister or whatever there, priest. And he took the scrolls with him that he had bought in a metal trunk from Cave 1, because there were no customs in those days. In any case, the church ran into financial problems, and in the 1954 period or so, he put an advertisement, or 52, 53, it's all in the Baigent book, put an advertisement in the paper, Wall Street Journal, scrolls for sale. Yigal Yadin was in New York. I think he was the consul or something. Anyway, some people brought this to his attention, and through a third party, he bought the rest of the scrolls from Cave 1 from this Syriac churchman, who I think ended up in San Diego, and maybe still living down there, the last I heard. In any case, this individual, I think he probably did now, but that was last I heard, was maybe 20 years ago. But all these materials went into the Museum of the Book that the Israelis opened up. And that's what everyone thought was the Dead Sea Scrolls. Cave 1 material, which were pretty good state of preservation. But the Israelis didn't try to make any political capital out of them. They published them all. They had them all on public display. They didn't try to make it difficult for anyone to see them. Everything was open, and so on and so forth. Then the armistice came, the partition of Palestine. All the material, the Qumran area came into the eastern side, which later Jordan took over. No one protested Jordan entering this area and basically annexing it. There was no UN meeting to protest this. The Jordanians annexed it. But the Jordanians didn't care about Dead Sea Scrolls. So there was a wall there, and you couldn't even go past it. And what happened was that the Bedouins started discovering new materials in other caves. And the person who was on the spot to deal with this was a well-known Dominican priest called Father Roland DeBook. And his assistant was a person by the name of Father Milik. He was a Polish priest. Milik was a manuscript man and did all the work for Father DeVoe. Father DeVoe was a very good, he'd been a diplomat of sorts. He was a very good diplomat, very well positioned. He was the head of the Dominican order in Palestine. I want to keep you a little bit more, and then I'll let you go, but I want to get to a handy place to stop here. And he basically set up the Qumran editorial team, which was, if you want to call it, Judenrein. No Jews, obviously. But also, really, not very many Protestants. I don't want to get into the Catholic Protestant squabbles here or anything like that. But the point was that Father DeVoe and Father Milik really looked at everything that came in and made the assignments of documents to people. A lot of people got documents from this official international committee that was formed that they did never finally published, and then passed on to their students and their students' students, and that's where we got into this whole squabble about the scrolls never being published. It took them forever, and then it started to become, they began to realize that it was, they could make academic capital maybe out of it in terms of their prestige and so on. Other reasons, laziness and that. It's all in the literature. But the point is that I think Father DeVoe and Father Millick didn't give any important documents to anyone whom they didn't really have confidence in their interpretation of it. Now this was told to me by a German scholar who since passed away, but who did a lot of the manuscript work for them. And he worked on the team and put manuscripts together. And what happened was in 1954 or so, or 5, an article appeared in the New Yorker magazine by a writer called Edmund Wilson. And Edmund Wilson, it was on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think it occurred over a couple of issues, was known as a left-wing communist sympathizer, fellow traveler, who wrote a book called To Finland Station. He was a literary critic. He was a jack of many trades. He liked to dabble in Islamic literature, things like that. He was in the Provincetown set. He knew Eugene O'Neill, people like that. He married a woman called Mary McCarthy, who was a famous woman writer, and so on and so forth. In any case, he was suggesting the scrolls had something to do with Christian origins in Palestine in these articles. And this German scholar told me that that frightened the editorial committee out of their minds. It was at that point that a curtain of secrecy was pulled down over the scrolls. And no one who wasn't trusted was allowed into the inner sanctum. And therefore you got an official interpretation. Because you see, when you got an official edition, it had usually an interpretation attached to it. And the public saw an editio princeps, an official edition by the Qumran publishing team. They assumed these scholars knew what they were talking about. And so the public said, well, they know, we don't know. So they accepted the official position. And that official position was known as the Essene theory. That depends what kind of Essenes you think these are. I accept the Essene theory as such, but that's to determine what I was trying to do as we were coming down to the history, what kind of Essenes these were. One of the scholars on this team, I'll soon finish now, was a person, just bear with me, called John Allegro. And John Allegro was a bit of a maverick from England, even though he has an Italian name, he actually was Protestant. And he was the one who got the copper scroll, which was a really important scroll that was found in Cave 3, just lying on the ground. Took it back to Manchester University where he was teaching and had it cut open in the metallurgy department. But someone had already read it through the backside and knew it was a treasure list. A temple treasure list. The hiding places of the temple treasure. So of course the Essene theory, people said, well, how could Essene, retiring Essenes, contemplative Essenes, be doing anything with temple treasure or hiding anything like that or know anything about that? And in the copper scroll, it even had a note that in where another copy or two of this document had been hidden. And these were, so what the official theory was by Millick, who finally got to publish this in the late 60s, was that this was really an imaginary document, maybe a child's exercise document, something like that, that wasn't to be taken seriously. Or maybe some passerby dropped it by accident. Couldn't relate to the Essene community. And anyway, it was imaginary. They did the same with the war scroll. And Allegro, John Allegro, records in his letters that were shown to me by Baigent, who got very friendly with his widow, where he recounts his chagrin at not being able, when he published his book for the paperback series in England about the Dead Sea Scrolls, he was forbidden by DeVoe and Millick to mention the copper scroll and what was in it. And that really sent him over the edge. So he determined, like many of us later, back in the early 50s, to get the scrolls out of the hands of these people. And he had a lot of good contacts with the Jordanian government, being a British scholar and so on. And he was just on the verge of achieving this with the Jordanian monarchy with his contacts in 1967 when the Israelis conquered the Rockefeller Museum and put the scroll team right back in control of the scrolls because they were afraid of problems with Rome. And they didn't want their situation in Jerusalem to be upset by anyone in, let's say, the Vatican or someplace else who might be worried about interference in the editorial process of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which the Israelis had no understanding what the Dead Sea Scrolls were even all about, except they were interesting Hebrew documents. They didn't understand that there was any relationship to Christianity to any extent, or anything like that, or how important they were, or how important it was not to be a member of the official theory, and so on and so forth. So we'll stop there, but I will say this, that cave 4 was found around 1952 or 53, and it was discovered by Bedouin. And DeVoe had been down there with his team, but DeVoe followed a gentlemanly approach to archaeology. They would sit under tents, you see pictures of them. I knew DeVoe's cook at the Auburn Institute. He had been the cook down there, and he described to me what was going on. I won't say on camera some of the other things he told me, but I would say this, that they let the Bedouins do the work, and somehow they missed K4. Now you can see K4 right from the settlement area. It's right across the ravine. Later on, after they left, the Bedouin cleaned it all out, went up to Jerusalem and sold pieces of it. There was a policy put in place by the official team that you would pay by the square centimeter for materials, because the Bedouin worked in gangs, and they would often rip things up and give a piece to everyone in the work gang. So we don't know if the destruction was totally because of the weather and age, or also because of the destruction. I don't think they meant to have the Bedouin rip these things up, but that added to the destruction and so on. In any case, they didn't find it themselves. The Bedouin found it, and they admit that they missed it. How you could miss it is like beyond me. We'll end there. This is what the Dead Sea Scroll deception is about.
About it being about